We just saw one of the biggest deals, at least regarding institutions and Bitcoin, that we've seen announced, period. It is actually shocking when you dig into it. Hard to imagine that it won't help push the price of Bitcoin up. Of course, I'm talking about Cantor Fitzgerald alongside Tether, Bitfinex, and SoftBank, with Jack Mallers as the CEO to basically replicate on a larger scale what MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor are doing. Absolutely huge news. We're going to break it down today, of course, with Yago and special and very frequent guest David Young from Coinbase. Let's go.
Let's go.
What is up, everybody? I'm Scott Melker, also known as the Wolf of Wall Street. Before we get started, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. I'm going to bring on David and Yago. Now, this is obviously the story of the day. I don't think there's a question about that. Cantor starts crypto firm with backing from Tether and SoftBank. As we dig into it, they're going to start with about 42,000 Bitcoin, so about $4 billion worth of Bitcoin. Already talking about raising convertible debt, going full MicroStrategy. Jack Mallers is also the CEO of Strike, is going to be the CEO of this company. And I think maybe the most shocking part to me is that SoftBank is contributing $900 million in Bitcoin. And at no point had I seen that SoftBank had $900 million in Bitcoin. So that either means they've been holding it quietly or they're buying it. I mean, that could be a part of this kind of steady bid we've seen. But David, I mean, this seems like an absolutely huge piece of news to me.
Oh, absolutely. I think this definitely legitimizes Bitcoin further as a treasury asset for a lot of these major public companies. So I think that we've been seeing it move this direction for a while now. And I'll be honest with you, because it was kind of used more speculatively rather than as a cash management tool. I think there was kind of questions around what, corporate accumulation would actually look like. But now I think that this is actually something that's going to set a pretty high floor on Bitcoin. I mean, we were kind of going that direction anyway over the course of the week. But now I think this locks it in at a much higher entry point for a lot of new players.
It's interesting here, Yago. He said, we're very inspired and encouraged by what MicroStrategy, this is Jack Mallers, and other publics have been doing in the public market. He says, we're not a pivoting business. We're not a business that sells video games to buy Bitcoin. Obviously, shots fired at GameStop. We're not and to buy Bitcoin, or sells hotel reservations to buy Bitcoin. I mean, he's not even criticizing MicroStrategy directly. He's friends with Saylor, but he's saying, I mean, Saylor has an underlying software business, right, that still exists at MicroStrategy that made him a billionaire in the first place. And then he says, our treasury is not trading at any premium to net asset value, so we believe it's a very attractive vehicle for those that are looking for Bitcoin exposure, and we think it could be one of, if not the winner of this trend. So he's basically also saying this isn't going to be like MicroStrategy where it's trading at many multiples to our treasury. Kind of interesting, because this is Saylor's model.
I don't know how the strategy works if you're not trading at a premium, right? If you're not trading at a premium, then there's nowhere for you to generate yield from, and you're basically just a closed fund ETF, basically your DCG. I think there's a couple of interesting things here. First of all, the players that are coming together, they need to be able to send a very, very clear signal to the market of credibility. And there's two kinds of credibility here. One is, like Michael Saylor, we have a very definitive strategy. We will not move away from that strategy over time. That is extremely important. Saylor, yes, Saylor's able to sell that story because he's been selling that story for the last 5 years. To do the same thing, they had to bring on Tether, who have a very, very clear strategy. Cantor Fitzgerald, who have an in with the White House. And we don't get much more of an in with the White House than that. And Jack Mallers, who I think is a great figurehead and CEO for this, because he's very, very media savvy and also has been very, very clearly tied to Bitcoin and Bitcoin only. And then on the other side of the credibility is, can we bring in substantial amounts of capital? When you are buying into this, do you know that there's going to be continued growth? Because it is basically that growth which is generating the yield. And then being able to bring in the deep pockets of SoftBank right? The people who are willing to send $10 billion or $20 billion to WeWork and Uber is a very, very strong signal. So I think this is a masterful play, and sort of obviously they're much smaller than MicroStrategy. They have, even if they manage to achieve the 42,000 Bitcoin, they'll have less than 1/10 the amount of BTC as yeah. But this is the most single sort of credible play, and I think what is really interesting is that this might cause premium compression for the entire space, right? MicroStrategy may see their premium.
Yeah, I mean, what happens to strategy? Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Is that when you have, there's a lot of people who are skeptical of strategy. They don't like how much it trades. There was above NAV. There was a time when it was one of the most shorted stocks on Wall Street, right? Now you have Cantor Fitzgerald, as you said, and Tether and SoftBank all coming together to do this and saying it won't trade at a premium to NAV. You have to imagine that when they start raising the convertible debt, most people on Wall Street would be much more comfortable buying this debt than MicroStrategy debt, David. I mean, don't you think?
I mean, that's kind of tough to say. I mean, certainly, like there are, like, I mean, you're kind of having very similar strategies competing against each other. I mean, like, it's hard to kind of gather like whether like investors are going to find this more palatable, but certainly it's cheaper right now than trying to pursue strategy. So I think that's probably going to help initially, but longer term, I think it's kind of tough. I mean, right now, I think like even with this 42,000 Bitcoin, that they would kind of make them the third largest corporate Bitcoin treasury. So I think people are probably going to need to consider that, considering the size of the deal.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So he also said here, he gave a great interview on Bloomberg, by the way, and Yago, you're right. He's just very media savvy. He's good at this. It's incredible that he can show up in an empty closet in a t-shirt or a hoodie and go on like financial television and seem still totally credible. He's one of the very few people that can pull that off. But he said, we do intend to raise as much capital as we possibly can to acquire Bitcoin. Again, my one rule to shareholders is, and he repeated this over and over again, our Bitcoin per share will grow. That was the only goal. So yeah, I don't really understand, to be quite frank, I don't understand the mechanics of this either. If you're not trading at where is the yield per se going to come from, and how do they continue to have their Bitcoin per share grow? Like, how do you orchestrate or engineer the price of your stock to make sure that happens?
My guess is that if that is indeed their strategy, then what they're going to be looking to do is create vehicles which allow different types of investors to express different types of risk versus yield appetite. So basically, Bitcoin grows on average with a huge amount of volatility, somewhere between 30 and 40% annualized in terms of its value, and has been doing so consistently for the last 10 years, right? Before that, it was doing even more. So if you're seeing 30 to 40%, and even if you think that's going to drop a little bit, go down to 25%, 20% annualized. If you're able to promise to investors, look, we will give you a guaranteed 10% annualized. We will cover the downside for you if there's any downside in the volatility of Bitcoin, but we get to take the upside. Then you're creating a new kind of bond. And so it might be that it's through this sort of like new bond mechanism backed by Bitcoin that they intend to raise the capital.
What do you think, David?
Yeah, I mean, that's frequently been the pushback, I think, for more conservative investors who are interested in Bitcoin, but perhaps, like their biggest concern is that they want to maintain some capital preservation. So I think that putting that threshold on the bottom and making sure that they don't go below it, but they can still capture upside. And then if there's any excess that kind of goes to the company, I think that, like that's a structure that certainly seems like a very, very palatable for many of your more conservative investors out there.
I mean, it is pretty wild. This is less than 1/10 of the Bitcoin that MicroStrategy has already acquired through the same process. I mean, it really is. It's a huge deal, but I hadn't really thought about how small it is relative that Yago pointed out, and that may make it a bit more of an uphill climb. It would be very hard for them to get to 500,000 Bitcoin. And by the way, if we did, we're going to have like a meaningful percentage of the supply held by institutions utilizing this strategy. We've seen miners doing it. I'm not sure that's great.
Well, I actually think there's nothing really wrong with that. What is interesting is how US-centric Bitcoin is starting to become, right? So much of the Bitcoin mining is done in the US. So much of the institution, like the vast majority of the institutional Bitcoin, which is an increasingly growing part of the overall Bitcoin pie, is held by US entities. And then sort of the pivot of the US federal government and US state governments towards Bitcoin. It's very interesting. And this is all happening in the backdrop of the dollar teetering more than it has since the end of World War II in terms of since the dollar became the reserve currency. I don't think it's been teetering this much, with the possible exception of 1971 when they went off the gold standard. So this is a very, very interesting moment. It's glacial, like these are tectonic shifts.
Yeah, I think that's the point, though. I think the timing here is absolutely not an accident. I mean, it comes behind like both a friendlier U.S. regulatory environment as well as a potential shift in the global order. And you don't usually see these things in real time. Normally, like if I was going to think about the dollar devaluation trend, for example, I'm thinking this is something that happens over the course of decades, and it's not like a single moment in time, but like we're in this weird perverse universe now where it's like it feels like just one inflection point where we're seeing Bitcoin actually change and the capital market assumptions around Bitcoin starting to shift in response to that. So I think this is absolutely coming on the heels of that.
So there's two things I want to point out and then move on to a bit more macro and where this does fit in context. First is that this company, Sol Strategies, raises $500 million in convertible notes issuance to buy Solana tokens. So just putting it on your radar. There's another company actually in Canada that's doing this with Ethereum, a friend of mine, David Towell, but it's very, very small. But 500 million is not a drop in the bucket. That's meaningful for someone to employ the exact same strategy we're talking about. I hate saying strategy and strategy over and over again, by the way, but it's the exact same strategy that Strategy is using here to buy Solana. So I want to note that. And Metaplanet hits 5,000 Bitcoin. Still a drop in the bucket, but it's a good milestone for them as corporate Bitcoin accumulation race heats up. I also saw there was another company in Hong Kong that was going to be raising some debt to follow this same strategy. So just want to point those out. Before we move on to the macro that we were talking about, Trump backs off on Powell. China, amid dire warnings. It's very clear that a bunch of people from Wall Street are very angry at what's happening here and have been warning him over and over again to lay off on China and to lay off on Powell, who's been up and down over the past few days. We're going to reduce, tariffs by 50%. We're having great talks with China. China coming back saying everything he's saying is not true. I don't know if you guys saw that quote, but pretty astounding. And even the ECB saying here, lose game on trade. So putting Bitcoin in the context of all of this. But David, like you're always kind of have a long view, a sensible roadmap for how you view things for Bitcoin, but that's in this context. And it's very hard, I think, to have a consistent view on the future when you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow on tariffs and all of the trade wars.
Yeah, I think normally I don't tend to trade the medium long-term perspective on Bitcoin, even though I have a very strong one in terms of what I think it represents as an alternative to the traditional financial industry. But I think here, given the circumstances around tariffs and what effectively does look like a Trump put emerging, I think that we're seeing that Bitcoin is really kind of establishing its own trend that's kind of separate away from U.S. equities, as well as even gold to some extent. I think that we've talked so much about this digital gold narrative around Bitcoin, but like the reality is that it kind of trades better in risk-on situations. Sometimes it's resilient to inflation, sometimes it's not, but it's more of a fair weather friend. But now it's starting to really kind of take on its own track, and we saw it this week. And it's very much a response to a lot of the news that's going on with respect to like Powell, with respect to like the China situation. And I think that China is absolutely, by the way, like the linchpin of trying to figure out the tariff strategy and what's going to happen on the macro side of things, because it seems like he's trying to align the flows to kind of combat what he sees as the greater concern around this kind of geopolitical risk. So I think that probably like we might be at the beginning of a place where Bitcoin really kind of has its own track that's separate from U.S. treasuries, that kind of like trades more in line with gold. I think that when you start seeing that gold isn't performing like its own, what people need it to do, which is, of course, to actually go against some of the geopolitical pressure. But outside of that, it doesn't offer you much of a return. I think Bitcoin actually does, and that's starting to occur to a lot of people.
I think also what's happening with gold is really fascinating. The gold is pumping, and gold is not a small asset. Gold, started out a few months ago as a $19 trillion asset. It's now past the $23 trillion
was it like
valuation.
13 when we were having these shows? We were always talking about gold will come down and Bitcoin and come up and they'll meet in the middle. Then all of a sudden, gold 22 trillion.
So just to give a sense of proportion, gold over the course of 1 week, just last week, added the entire crypto market cap to its own market cap, right? It grew its market cap by the size of all of crypto, Bitcoin and everything else. And that's really interesting. It's really interesting to see gold, which is such a stable asset, generally speaking.
Supposed to be
has
boring.
gone from 2,800 to 3,400 over a relatively short period of time. And the market that Bitcoin is going after, right? So sort of like the same way that Solana is going after Ethereum and Ethereum is going after Bitcoin. Bitcoin is going after gold, and as gold grows, the space for Bitcoin to grows even more. So I think what's happening with Bitcoin, with gold, is extremely bullish for Bitcoin, and more than that, underlies the fact that even though we in these shows and on Twitter and sort of like the newspapers and op-eds, everyone's always talking about tectonic shifts, but when you start seeing it in gold, it's real. It's like it's happening.
I will say we're going to have Dan on later, and I see him in the back. But I think he showed a chart that every time gold consolidated, Bitcoin went up, and Bitcoin consolidated, and gold would go up. And so you can expect that we've seen in the past that Bitcoin would likely follow gold on a move like this. That would not be unexpected. And here are those top assets by market cap. It's incredible how much gold has just smashed everything else. Bitcoin, by the way, was 5 2 days ago when it was over 94,000. Now it's back to 8, but it had or 6, maybe it was 5 or 6. It surpassed silver and had surpassed Google before falling down, but it's knocking on the door. I mean, Bitcoin being bigger than silver is just an astounding thought. It really blows my mind. But David, like, how do you, in this context of such uncertainty, how do you forecast what you think is likely to happen? Like, I know that Bitcoin could follow gold, but if Trump goes with 250% tariffs against China, nothing's gonna go pumping into the clouds, right? I mean, it's really hard to imagine that.
Yeah, I think it's still tough to kind of play things in the spot market. Although that said, we've seen this over the last few days. It's a really difficult prospect to be short anything at this point because the convexity around headlines is so high that your risk reward for kind of positioning that way, I think, really doesn't work for you. So I think that for the time being, I think it's probably going to be about being opportunistic, being very, very tactical about things. So honestly, like, I don't think the floor for Bitcoin is like much lower than what we've seen in this cycle already. So I think people who thought that they could get Bitcoin at like the 72,000 level, I think now, given everything that's happened, especially like with the news today about corporate treasuries kind of pursuing this strategy, I don't think you're going to be able to get there now. So I think, it's really hard to say that if we're going to keep on this trend, if we break 95, then I think we're just going to keep going in that direction. But like, if we kind of like bounce around here and things are choppy, and of course we haven't gotten away from the headlines quite yet, I think that we're still very headline driven. Then, I think probably go here for a little while longer, but I expect the turn to happen probably, or us reaching the lows, us finding the bottom, probably sometime in the next couple of weeks. I think that by the time we get to the end of Q2, we're in a much better setup for like Q3 and Q4.
Yeah, I just want to quickly show the Bitcoin chart to support exactly what you said, because it's hilarious how this always happens. If you are a chartist or just understanding human psychology, we had that high, last March at around 73,835. That was the line everyone talked about. If Bitcoin ever gets the dip, it comes back to test the all-time high as support. So what happens when everybody's watching literally the same area? You get front run by a few $100 and everybody whiffs, right? The big money comes in above. Actually, I thought it was coming in above here. Or you nuke all the way down and those bids actually fill. But the safest bet here was just bid like 76 if you want to hit 74, right? If you were trading it. And of course, it doesn't get down to those levels that you were talking about.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, like, I'm not the biggest fan of technical charts, to be honest with you. I think that, yes, supply demand like matters a lot in these markets, probably more so than market fundamentals. But I think at this point in time, we're still kind of subject to a lot of like the macroeconomic factors, which are going to still remain dominant, I would say, until probably early to mid-May.
Yeah, the reality is we're just subject to whatever Trump says on any given day. Right. It's I've never seen anything like it. I mean, Yago, what do you make of it?
Well, I mean, you know, 3 months ago, I started saying we were going to see a significant turnaround in May. I still think that. I think it's traditionally seen Bitcoin lag M2 supply, so M2 money supply, by 3 months. M2 money supply started increasing globally 3 months ago. Or just under 3 months ago. So I think probably there are people out there who believe what I believe and are expecting the same thing. I think we're going to see strength in May, and I think that strength in May is probably likely to continue. I think the bigger story, and that's sort of like that's a short-term story. I think the bigger story right now is that Bitcoin was created as an alternative asset. So you don't get a lot more alternative than Bitcoin. It's an alternative to the current monetary system, the current global system, the current everything system. And when the world is in chaos, that's when people start looking for alternatives. So Bitcoin is a chaos asset, and the world is becoming increasingly chaotic. And I don't think there's any way to unring that bell. The US is never going to be able to it takes a lifetime to build a reputation and a day to ruin it. The US is never going to have the same global credibility it had unless there's another sort of World War III and the US steps in to save the world again. That's the only way that you rebuild that level of credibility.
Crazy.
And so I think we are moving towards a world in which there is less and less globalization in the physical realm, which means that globalization isn't going to disappear. It's going to move into the digital realm. And so people are going to want borderless finance, borderless assets, and that's Bitcoin and crypto. So I think we're just getting started.
So speaking of things that obviously added major credibility to the United States, we have this chart here of Trump's meme coin. As you might have noticed yesterday, the Trump token that was launched within 48 hours of his presidency went from $9 to $16 in a day from peak to trough. So a massive move. It almost doubled in price. The reason being that Trump's going to host a dinner with top holders of his meme coin. We've seen this with his NFTs, of course. I think it's 220 top holders. A certain amount who are the topper holders will get a private audience with him. How is this not a security now? I mean, the whole thing was that it's a collectible, I guess, if you hold the collectible. But like, obviously saying like, I'm the president and 220 of you who buy enough of my thing are going to get to hang out with me seems like that's being promoted.
I'm not sure that the
I guess it's
constitutional
not technically, yeah.
I'm not sure the framers ever said anything. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the president can't auction off meetings with himself. I think it's been frowned upon by most other administrations, but
I know, but once it has utility, it's not a meme coin anymore, right? So, but
well,
David, yeah. Go ahead. I was just gonna say, David, like in the midst of all of this, like, don't we have enough nonsense happening?
I don't know. I mean, to Yago's point, I don't know about the commercialization of the office and whether it certainly, I think,
I shouldn't have said the security part or the legal issue. I'm just saying, like, amongst all the things that are giving us uncertainty in our market, I just don't feel like this helps too much.
Yeah, I don't completely disagree with that. I think it's, for an asset class that we've been trying to like legitimize, have become more legitimate in the eyes of your traditional investors, for example. I mean, this is kind of could be problematic for that. But yeah, same time, it's like I don't control this. I don't know.
So,
Okay, Scott,
yeah,
uncertainty is bad for the economy and it's bad for people, right? No one wants to live in uncertainty, but it's good for Bitcoin. So, that's why
I mean,
Bitcoin's a hedge, right?
it is very important to note. I've showed the charts on every show, but like Bitcoin just made a new all-time high versus the NASDAQ. Obviously, Bitcoin had performed well against gold. Gold has been smashing it, but to say that it's correlated to either of those and is following the market are very, very temporary things. I do think that Bitcoin has largely been uncorrelated and has really shown that. David, I'd love your take on this because it did go down in the 70s very briefly, but most of the time since Liberation Day, Bitcoin chopped around in the 80s and then went up, even while everything else was going down. And most days you don't see that old thing where the market opens, stock market opens and Bitcoin does whatever the NASDAQ does. It really does feel like it's separated here, at least. I'm wondering if that's an institutional or sovereign bid or something, but it does seem that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bitcoin. It's so many layers on this, right? Because there's Bitcoin, there's the rest of the crypto market, and then like how are each of these two things kind of performing? Because I think I know this wasn't your direct point, but like what are altcoins doing compared to like everything else that's happening in the world? And they've definitely suffered more, and I think that their correlation to U.S. equities has been somewhat higher than say Bitcoin, and of course. All these things are statistics. It depends on the window you're choosing. I like to look at, something greater than a 30-day window because that's what my stats teacher taught me. Like it had to be like 40-day window or higher. But like generally, like the numbers I've been looking at, it's been kind of showing that it's actually been in the order of like 60%, hasn't really breached that. And then it's kind of been bouncing around 40 to 50, which, like I think that's kind of like around the cusp where that relationship still is significant. And like so far what this is telling me is that I think Bitcoin is starting to decouple more from your traditional assets. I mean, like the world itself isn't necessarily running behind US equities anymore either. I feel like we should be paying more attention to what's happening in the bond markets more than anything else. And things that people never look at, which is like swap spreads and other things that determine credit risk. But I think for the time being, Bitcoin definitely looks like it's operating more on some of these idiosyncratic factors that drive it.
Totally agree. Yago, final thoughts before I let you guys go.
Chaos is a ladder, and in this case, the ladder looks like the Bitcoin chart.
It's a blockchain, a ladder. That's all it is, right? It's perfect. Well, thank you, David and Yago, so much as always for joining, guys. Give them both a follow on X. Check them out. Everything they have. You guys are absolutely the best. Thanks again.
Thanks, guys.
All right, guys, before we move on to Dan, I want to give a highlight here, of course, as you're used to Aptos right here. This is from Avery, who is obviously the CEO of Aptos after Mo left and one of the founders, and just an incredible thread here that you can read on X highlighting everything that Aptos is doing. So it really is the blockchain that's quietly building the rails for the future of global finance. They're one of the few that has the three largest stable coins by market cap on there. They have blazing fast speed, incredibly cheap transactions are now at sub 150 millisecond block times. There's over 160,000 transactions per second. They just committed $200 million more to build in the ecosystem. And they're included in Bitwise's new crypto ETP. We love Bitwise. Really always talk about what's coming for mainstream adoption. How will it happen? Where will it happen? It's going to be on layer ones like Aptos, where we finally see the future of finance being built. You just have to be patient. So check out Aptos, of course, everything they've got going on. And now on to Dan. Good morning.
Morning.
So that gold, we were talking, gold, Bitcoin. I had to reference you. I was about to bring you on, but I didn't want to make it weird. But listen, we've had this gold move. I've been arguing of late. I mean, I guess we'll see what happens today, but gold's starting to look like a blow off top. And that daily candle 2 days ago had me feeling like maybe gold's going to chill for a bit. And that could mean it's Bitcoin's turn to follow.
Yeah, I mean, that, like you said, that tells us, okay, pay attention for a potential shift. The bears have to prove a lot on that daily and weekly chart still, but it's a start in terms of and again, what the chart I showed last week was a 2-week time frame. So got to be zoomed out.
I didn't mean today. Yeah.
Right. And people will be like, oh, well, gold and Bitcoin were trading inverse today. You were right. And I'm like, well, I mean, I'm talking bigger picture. This has to play out for weeks, but something to be keeping an eye on. And, Bitcoin right now is battling this previous support zone that we held forever. And then I marked it here just by this top at 95 and then that lower high. And you can see it was a great zone of previous support. Then it was resistance, and we're battling it again right now. So again, we know Bitcoin has had a great move over the past week plus. There were little clues just in the sense that we're talking again last week where names like the crypto stocks, MSTR, even GME, which is now, I guess, a crypto stock, they were showing relative strength to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was showing relative strength to NASDAQ. And as you mentioned, Bitcoin on Tuesday this week, all-time high, relative strength versus the NASDAQ. So a couple little signs that just had me, okay, time to pay attention to crypto now. And, you had MSTR set that monthly higher low officially by breaking the high of last month. So starting to shape up and looking good. But one thing to remind yourself is, okay, Bitcoin has had a nice move off the low, but we will eventually have to confirm a weekly uptrend. So just keep that in mind. We have the space for a weekly higher low, but if we're going to see follow through and, an all-time high test and ideally new all-time highs, just keep in mind that we will eventually have to confirm that weekly uptrend. So, it's the kind of thing where I want some exposure now, but if I'm going to add exposure at this point, being a little bit more conservative, I would want to be waiting for a weekly higher low. But that's just because I was grabbing some positions last week and don't want to get too overly ambitious as we're testing a key resistance zone right now.
So, I guess this area right around 94, 95, obviously a very key area. I would say the support at this point is 88-ish, where we just kind of made that first higher high. But making that high, for me, at least, I view 88 as the break to a new higher high. I don't know if you do too. I can kind of show it here. But obviously, we had this downtrend of lower highs and lower lows all the way from the all-time high. Nice break, big volume above the 50 and 200 MA, and broke on a major candle spread and volume that level. I mean, so to me, that screams like retest. So you did 88,800, right? But in general, feels like that's kind of a confirmation that the downtrend here is over.
Yeah, it definitely is a character shift. And the most glaring thing for me was, I believe it was Monday, where the NASDAQ, Monday, big red NASDAQ and big green Bitcoin. And that is, as you mentioned, if you zoom out, you can talk about a lack of correlation. Okay, I can get on board with that. But when you're zoomed in, they very often from 9:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. will trade very similarly. And they were going inverse, and that's very rare recently. So that was another flashing something is very different here than what we've been seeing recently. And, my assumption is that GameStop has been buying. We're not going to know for a while until after the fact, but I would assume that's a high probability of what's been contributing to this. But
and SoftBank maybe. And SoftBank maybe. Yeah.
And speaking of CEP,
it felt so orderly. This rise felt so orderly to me.
Yeah, it's looking great. And this is an example of how Twitter helps me make money as a trader, where I didn't know anything about this. I see the clip of Jack Mallers on Twitter. I was a little late, but then I jumped to the chart and I saw a little, I traded this yesterday because I saw a little base of support at 1475. And that essentially showed me, okay, that's a level I can play off of now. I don't know anything about the fundamentals aside from, okay, Jack Mallers Bitcoin, his timing is right. Bitcoin just had a nice bull move. And so that 1475 level was a level to play off of. And then you get this play often where when it's a recent IPO or something like a SPAC, you get the blue sky push, and the bulls know that they can load up during regular hours. And then it's so illiquid, you can run it in extended hours. And, GME was a picture perfect example of that back in the day. But just be really cautious with the liquidity on this one. It's still running, but a lack of liquidity is a bull's best friend when you're in blue sky breakout. Just be aware that when it tops, it's going to drop 30% really quickly. And there's a lot of misinformation out there on Twitter where people are like, look at the market cap, 42,000 Bitcoin, and this market cap is way too small. There's going to be massive dilution when they change to the ticker XXI and it actually goes through. So just be aware that that's misinformation that's going on in Twitter, but it's still running at this point. And
I didn't realize it pumped that hard. That's crazy. Nice.
Yeah. I fumbled it. Well, I made a nice trade yesterday, but I knew to hold overnight for the gap up. And it's just so hard when the bell rings and it's after hours and there's no bid support and we start dropping back down, and it's just like you got to hold and trust. And I struggled to do that. This is one where I definitely should have made more and kept a position for today, but always another lesson and tricky. You know, it's again, this thing's going to drop 20% real fast once it tops, but it hasn't topped yet. So don't be chasing up here, obviously.
What else are you looking at?
Just in terms of the broader market, this is the most important chart for me. This is the S&P 500, just because it's nice and clear. This is the 12-hour. We've got, multiple tops, including yesterday. We've got multiple bottoms. And if this breaks bull, it's a great sign for Bitcoin because it will be, the highest level that the broader market has seen in a couple of weeks. And that could help Bitcoin get over that 95,000 hurdle. If we see a little bit of weakness, then we can trade sideways within this range for another few days for sure. But this is my broader market guide, and it matters a bit to Bitcoin and the crypto stocks because if I'm bullish those, I definitely want to see this chart break bull. So definitely one to be keeping an eye on over the next couple of days. And in addition to that, still keep an eye on CRV as a lead altcoin bull. It keeps standing out, and it's been a little bit, it was the only red name out of a huge green list yesterday. It's one of the few green names on a red list today. So doing its own thing to a certain degree, but this is a nice example of a back test. There's your resistance and you're back testing and trying to hold it. So again, I'm not watching many altcoins. That's one of the ones I'm watching. Binance is boring, but this beautiful tightening range tells us that in May, Binance volatility is going to spike when this tightening range breaks. So just keep it on the back burner in terms of paying attention to the tightening range because it will break. And other than that, ETH BTC, is this the bottom? Well, let's break the weekly lower high every single candle pattern as the first baby step to saying maybe. But I'm not putting any eggs in that basket at this point. I'm still constantly keeping an eye on it, but again, the burden of proof is on the bulls.
So really quick, I do have to go. Everybody give Dan a follow, of course. Check out all of his other content just to show you guys, because today I go on right after I'm on with Dan. I go on serious business briefing for these quick things. But today is going to be 30 minutes long, and apparently you guys can call in. So 844-942-7866, and you can just troll me relentlessly. Call and make fun of my face or something. I don't know. Be better than having to answer questions about Trump and tariffs, which is never really what's going to happen. Dan, thank you so much, guys. I got to run and go do that now. Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow for the Friday 5. Later, Dan.
That's dope.